For those of you who may not know, Don Ferguson is the Executive Director of Animal Protection Services of Saskatchewan, which is the animal protection agency responsible for enforcement of the Animal Protection Act here in Saskatchewan, except within the City of Regina. Before this, he investigated over 4,000 files of animal cruelty and neglect with the Alberta SPCA and Calgary Humane Society as a peace officer under the Animal Protection Act of Alberta. He is also instructed at the Justice and Solicitor General Staff College, providing instruction for the Alberta Peace Officer Investigator program. Don is a registered veterinary technologist with the Saskatchewan Veterinary Medical Association and completed his diploma in 2005 from Lakeland College in Vermilion. Prior to his law enforcement career, he served 20 years in the Canadian Armed Forces with the Canadian Airborne Regiment and the 1st Battalion of Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. Don, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Josh. I will hopefully begin sharing my screen now.
Okay, I'll let you know when we can see it. It says you started screen sharing, but we're not seeing any slides yet. Oh, and now it stopped.
Okay.
Looks like, okay, there we go. Now we can see your PowerPoint and there are your slides.
Perfect. So I just want to, there'll be some of the information that Raj or Dr. Prem Kumar provided that I'm going to go over. But basically today, I wanted to share with who we are as an agency, what it is, and how we do it. Feel free, obviously, to enter in any questions. But I titled this one Animal CSI because unlike the television show, there isn't a conclusion in 45 minutes. These are detailed, nuanced investigations, particularly with the way that the Act is written and the case law that's been provided. Animal welfare isn't a new thing. St. Francis of Assisi, back in the 12th century, said that if you have men who will exclude any of God's creatures from the shelter of compassion and pity, you have men who will deal likewise with their fellow men. That is even more true today. We see that animal problems are caused by humans with problems, and it extends into things like the violence link. I just love that. And in fact, fun fact, I actually have that tattooed on my back when I started working with the Alberta SPCA, and it's a mission that I take very seriously. So Animal Protection Services, we're organized as a nonprofit organization. This is a throwback to when animal protection enforcement was done by nonprofit organizations. You see it still with the BC SPCA. You see a move now with the Provincial Animal Welfare Service in Ontario and Manitoba, where these are government agencies, and we no longer have public enforcement done by donation dollars, and it's done by the public. But we are still initially organized by that. That was done back in 2015. We have 9 full-time animal protection officers, an operations assistant, and a communications officer, which is works as our first point of contact and takes in all the calls, enters them into our database, and dispatches them to the appropriate animal protection officer. Myself as the ED, and we have a volunteer board of directors as per our nonprofit status. We were created in 2015 to take up the enforcement work that the Saskatchewan SPCA had done for over 40 years. We do livestock complaints across the entire province and companion animal complaints in both rural and urban areas that don't have their own APOs. And that, in fact, just means that with Prince Albert, Moose Jaw, and another location, Saskatoon, moving away from employing animal protection officers, there's just ourselves and Regina Humane Society, as Raj identified, as animal protection agencies. There's still a lot of confusion with members of the public as to what our organization does. Are we an animal rights organization? Are we animal control? We are an enforcement agency. Our role is to provide enforcement of the Animal Protection Act, primarily through education and compliance, and obviously taking the appropriate legislative steps if necessary. The enforcement model within Saskatchewan, as was indicated, we have an agreement with the Ministry of Agriculture to respond to complaints and do enforcement of the legislation. The Regina Humane Society does enforcement within their own city limits, but they do not do livestock complaints. They don't have the training for it. We have done livestock complaints within the city limits of Regina, and that is for at Ezra's place. I always have trouble saying that. And it was related to the elk and bison that are kept there at that facility. RCMP and other police are APOs and have the authority to enforce the act. Many instances, they don't have the equipment or training to do that enforcement, but they certainly can. And we're really appreciative of those partners, as in many instances where we execute search warrants, that they are there to keep the peace and provide safety and security for us and the people that we're dealing with. The Animal Protection is a provincial piece of legislation. It came into force September 17th, 2018, and there is a fine of $25,000 and up to 2 years less 1 day of incarceration and or both, an order prohibiting from owning animals for a specific period of time, up to and including life, and then the order to provide a current address and allow inspections without a warrant. I don't think there's a clear understanding of just how impactful this actually is. Essentially, it allows animal protection officers to breach someone's Section 8 charter rights to illegal search and seizure, to go onto their property at any time to ensure that they do not have animals and they're not breaching the conditions should they be charged and convicted in an order being made. And of course, this is separate from the seizure of animals. The seizure of animals is if the owner or person in charge doesn't relieve the animals of their distress. We can certainly take animals into protective custody to relieve them of their distress or seize them. So the act says that no person shall cause an animal to be in distress, and no person responsible for an animal shall cause or permit the animal to be or to continue to be in distress. Excuse me. I forgot to mention at the beginning of my presentation, although this one isn't bad, some of the images may be disturbing, but this is the reality of the work that we do. And I'm going to use several examples of things that we deal with regularly, as well as with the case examples. So should you need to, avert your eyes. So Dr. Prem Kumar had talked about distress. People talk about abuse and neglect, and we refer to it simply as distress, because you can see in section 2C that abuse and neglect are actually in the definition of distress. And so that's deprived of food and water to maintain the animal in a state of good health, care or shelter, veterinary care or medical attention, in need of reasonable protection from injurious heat and cold. You'll notice that injurious heat and cold is separated from shelter. They identify them as two separate things. Typically, we see injurious heat with dogs in hot, and injurious cold, animals left outside with although it might have a shelter, it still subjects them to injurious cold. Again, wounded, in pain, suffering, abused or neglected, and kept in conditions that are unsanitary. Although there's no definition for unsanitary, we use the Tufts Animal Care and Condition Scale. If anybody care to look it up, it is recognized by the courts and is actually in the veterinary forensics textbook, and it details quite well what unsanitary conditions are. The other is will significantly impair the animal's health or well-being over time. Again, this is a significant change to the previous act in where we had to wait until an animal is actually in distress. In this case, we can be proactive. If they're going to be kept in conditions that is likely to lead to them being in distress over time, we can take action if the owner does not contravene the prescribed standards, code of practice, and guidelines, and then abandoned by its owner or person responsible that causes or is likely to cause distress. Most regulatory offenses have an exemption section. Certainly the Animal Protection Act does as well. And if the animal is being kept in a manner consistent with the standard, code of practice, or guideline that is prescribed as acceptable, or in accordance with a generally accepted practice of animal management, or is otherwise reasonable in the circumstances, these exemptions are made so that industry standard practices identified in the National Farm Animal Care Code, as well as hunting, fishing, and trapping, although they may cause pain and things like that, they're not considered distress. Again, just as I spoke about, that common husbandry, agriculture, hunting, and fishing and trapping practices, I'm going to have to update my slide because the picture on the right with the recent SVMA bylaws being changed, we won't likely see many of those cosmetic surgeries again, and we won't see, hopefully, too many of the jobs like that being done at home either. Accepted practices, they are in the animal protection regulations, and as Dr. Prem Kumar indicated, they are in the regulations, and there is a whole list of them, the National Farm Animal Care Codes, and a number of other guidelines that we use when assessing animals when we are called to a concern. So our investigative process, there are provisions within the Act under Section 12 to do inspections. With the number of staff that we have, with the number of officers covering about 65,000 square kilometers each of the province, we have the ability to be complaint driven or reactive enforcement. So we're reacting to concerns provided to us by members of the public. Our initial investigation, we attend the file to determine if whether the concern that's been reported is valid or not. In many cases where you see the unfounded file, it's a situation where, one, the person that is concerned isn't able to see that the animal is being provided care, or two, there's a lack of knowledge as to what is appropriate care for that animal. But again, we would rather have people call and have an unfounded complaint than people not call, and we end up with a train wreck with a number of dead animals. The inconclusive from the initial investigation is the fact that due to access to property, as I said before, the Section 8 protections from illegal search and seizure is that the owner is not consenting to let us into their residence, and we can't see the animal. There's nothing currently in our Act, unlike Manitoba, that compels the owner to have to show us the animal. In that case, we have to continue and do further investigations to obtain a search warrant to enter into that property or private dwelling. And then the last one is a founded file, that there's an actual concern from the complaint that gave us reasonable and probable cause to attend. If it's a founded file, we'll leave requirements and follow up. So our primary focus is to work with the owner to improve the situation for the animal, as well as provide education about what is appropriate. Should the individual not be compliant, or appears to be not compliant, or we've provided education and we follow up and see that there's been no improvement to the animal's conditions, we can issue a corrective action order. This corrective action order is actually chargeable under the legislation, and this allows us to order a person to do anything that is required to relieve the animal of their distress. Understanding that we can fluctuate between, depending on the severity of the conditions that we see, we can go from initial attendance to a corrective action order to seizing the animal and taking into protective custody immediately, depending on the owner's willingness to relieve the animals of their distress. I refer to it as they choose their own adventure. Once they've determined that they will not be providing care, it triggers our responsibility to make sure that that care is provided. Consider further intervention. So again, seizure if the animal has failed to relieve the animal of its distress, and then prosecution where and when it's appropriate. We use a number of experts, particularly veterinarians, but there are others. We'll contact the livestock feed extension specialists for nutritional requirements as well on many occasions, but we'll look for advice on injury and disease management. We're not veterinarians. We can't prescribe anything. We see what's normal. When we see something that's not normal and it looks to be an injury or some type of disease, we will make the owner take the animal to the veterinarian of their choice to have it done. If we have a situation where euthanasia may be required, we'll contact the veterinarian to see if that is indeed their recommendation, as well as conditions on the corrective action order. And then we also, when looking at seizure of animals, many times based on veterinarian's opinion, we'll do the assessment for the seizure of animals from a situation. So speaking of the seizure of animals, logistically, it's one of the things that we have to take a lot of time. We've had defense counsel chastise us that we showed up at a property with a search warrant with all the trucks and everything needed to remove the animals from the property, and they say that we've already made a determination that we were going to remove those animals. Well, that's not the case. Anything all the time with our investigations is only a potential seizure until we've determined that the owner is not going to relieve them of their distress. But should that come to be, we need to be prepared to take that animal into custody, provide the transportation to an appropriate care provider that's going to provide food, water, shelter, and then obviously veterinary care, and if necessary, euthanasia. Based on last year's case files, we ended up seizing animals in the past couple of years. This is a 5-year average. It's between 4 and 6% of our cases result in animals being taken into protective custody. So it is a last resort. Trivia question for everybody out there, not just Animal Protection Services. And I'll see how many I get in the chat later, so I won't give the answer. What percent of law enforcement encounters are resolved through education and compliance? So give that some thought till the end of the presentation. The timeline from the initial investigation to seizure varies. It can be the same day to several weeks, depending on the situation. Again, generally on the advice of a veterinarian. There are provisions under the Animal Protection Act for the return of the owner's animals. Animals are still considered property. And so if they pay the expenses associated or costs associated with the seizure, and then rectify all the conditions identified in the corrective action order, then the person may be able to get their animals back. So this is where I'll use a police example. In this case, a homicide. Someone's called to, police service is called to a location where they see an individual that is down on the ground and not moving. You have a patrol officer that will attend. That patrol officer determines that this person is likely dead and appears to be a victim of foul play. They will cordon off the scene. They'll call a supervisor, and a detective sergeant will come out, go, yep, definitely a crime scene, definitely a homicide. They will then call in their crime scene technicians to then collect all the evidence and compile it for them so that they can further their investigation. Well, an animal protection officer is all of those people. They're doing all of those skills. They're the initial responder. They're the lead investigator, And in many cases, with the number of animal protection officers attending, they're the ones collecting the evidence. And so we have to do a detailed assessment of all the animals in their environment, the number and type of animals, including deceased animals. We're doing body condition scoring, scales of 1 to 5 or 1 to 9, a full description of all of those things that we identified as being or are identified in distress. Do they have access to shelter? Protected from injurious heat and cold? Do their body condition score indicate that they're provided sufficient food and water to maintain them in a state of good health? Is the quality of feed, if it's a livestock situation, we'll take feed and water samples in most of those cases to have that feed tested, because we might have a situation where the owner is feeding the animals, but they're just not providing sufficient quality and quantity for the animal. To determine that. The detailed assessment of the care the animals received. So any abnormalities, injuries, illnesses, are they being appropriately treated? Is this calf that's being separated here, is it being regularly fed, seeing how it's been separated from its mom? Is it being treated with some type of appropriate penicillin for the upper respiratory issues that are having? And then we've got to note any general problems, the routine husbandry deficiencies. The other thing that we have to do is make sure that we're identifying each and every animal, what they look like. So in many of our large search warrants, we're taking in excess of 700 or more pictures that clearly identify the scene itself, the conditions, and then all the animals that exist within those conditions. So that's hazards within the yard, ventilation, and certainly documenting the unsanitary conditions. After we've had a seizure, we are looking for written reports from veterinarians, the livestock feed extension specialists. The other one that we get is from pathologists, from prairie diagnostic services, or from the forensic veterinarian who's done necropsies on the animals. So we're looking about facts about the food, water, shelter, and care that they saw, supported by the photos that we took and samples that we whether that's fecal, air in some cases for we'll take ammonia. We'll also, as I said, do feed and water samples, and then determining was these care and conditions adequate. There is one statutory defense for the Animal Protection Act, and that is due diligence. Has the person shown due diligence that they would not be convicted of the offense at the time of trial? And then for veterinarians or that professional that's providing that report, we're looking for a concise and professional statement. This becomes their statement in court. Coupled with that is we'll get a copy of their curriculum vitae, and this is for them to be qualified by the court as an expert witness in that particular area of expertise. Again, once we've done a seizure of animals under search warrant and we remove the animals, we have to provide disclosure. We're obligated to release all materials from an investigation. So we record all our observations, not just the bad things that'll support the elements of the offense to lay charges. And defense counsel will look for missing items. So if we've taken a photograph where our thumb's in front of it, we disclose the photograph with our thumb in front of it. Because with the raw data, defense counsel can see that there's a photo missing should we not include it. We are, as a law enforcement agency, held to a very high standard, and therefore we must follow all the rules set out by the court and our judicial system. So at trial, veterinarians and others can be qualified as an expert witness. Animal protection officers, although they have a lot of experience, are not considered experts and cannot provide opinion evidence. All we can give is factual evidence as to what we observed, saw, smell, heard, any of those things like that. Those experts, veterinarians, pathologists, forensic veterinarians, can provide opinion evidence of distress, pain and suffering, or abuse. So before trials could take several months to years from the time of a seizure to a trial, now there is a Supreme Court case, R.V. Jordan, and that Supreme Court decision has said that a regulatory offense like the Animal Protection Act, that they have to have their trial within 18 months of the charges being laid. Otherwise, that could be dismissed. And for something more serious, the criminal code offenses, they have 30 months for the Crown to bring forward that case and have charges later. It'll be dismissed. There's still numerous court appearances that occur. The one thing, it's not like television. For those people that are veterinarians or might be experts on the webinar today that are called to be expert witnesses, the judge, the legal professionals, the counsels that are involved have little or no animal knowledge. I basically will tell veterinarians that you're basically teaching a grade 8 classroom about your area of veterinary medicine, except they're more engaged than a grade 8 class. You want to use simple terms. You can use your jargon, but it's easier if you can provide clear understanding for the court to understand why this was distress or why this was pain and suffering. Cross-examined by defense counsel is always the most challenging, particularly if there's a self-represented accused. We still have an adversarial judicial system where you have the right to face your accuser, and they will ask you tough questions. And again, people have always, there are people that go, oh, well, how could defense counsel defend that animal abuser? He's so terrible. And one of the defense counsels had said something to me early on in my training that I thought was very good. And they said, I may be representing that individual, but really what I'm doing is I'm making sure that the judge doesn't make any errors, you as an investigator didn't make any errors, and that the Crown didn't make any errors, to make sure that our system is fair and just for everyone. So some of the things that we'll sadly typically run into, starvation. So you can see from the body condition score of the cow on the left as well as the horse on the right, you really shouldn't be able to see ribs, hips, backbone, and I certainly shouldn't be able to play xylophone on the ribs or the spinous process coming off of the spine. As I spoke about earlier, inadequate feed quality or quantity. There are many instances where we've had people that have had feed in front of their animals, but because of the poor quality of the feed, essentially they're not getting the essential nutrients they need because the feed is of poor quality. Untreated injuries or illnesses, just simple neglect, lack of hoof care, lack of appropriate care, certainly lashing this cow to this dilapidated tractor while attempting to repair this prolapse, although maybe they have done so in the past. Certainly this one needed veterinary care once it had gone down and wasn't receiving the appropriate care. Poor management. A lot of the times we see poor management or husbandry practices that end up causing distress. Simply picking up all your twine so that it doesn't get wrapped around and cutting the blood supply off to these hooves is a simple thing to do. Again, poor management. We're having animals that have multiple births but not being provided with protection from injurious cold and appropriate shelter so that they can lamb in a warm environment, and that these lambs aren't just freezing to death the minute that they hit the ground. Again, unsanitary or not appropriate conditions. Although we have dogs that appear in this slide that appear to be of a northern breed, certainly in Saskatchewan, those overturned crates just coming as we are into winter would not be a suitable shelter and certainly wouldn't provide adequate shelter or protection from injurious cold. Again, certainly we can provide some better conditions, and definitely in this situation with the housing of multiple animals, it increased competition for shelters, and there weren't enough shelters for all of these animals. We see untreated illnesses. Sadly, the discussion that was happened on this, we were actually there for a livestock call and saw a number of barn cats that were just in horrible condition. And the individual's response was, well, it's just a barn cat. Well, even barn cats deserve protection under the Animal Protection Act. And if they're your barn cats, you're responsible for them, and you're responsible for treating them when they're wounded or ill. Again, unsanitary conditions that we've seen, that is a number of days accumulation of urine and feces where these animals can no longer get out of it. And it's actually in amongst their food and water, completely unacceptable. Neglect. In this case, it was a good example of an animal call leading to the human responsible for it getting human services activated. This dog had been neglected to the point where it was essentially a tripod. The rear legs had fused together from matting and urine and feces. Ultimately, the dog was euthanized, but this level of neglect was an indicator that when the owner was taken into hospital, they had similarly been neglecting themselves. In fact, they were just as skinny as this dog was once the hospital staff was able to look at them. And they were not oriented to time, place, or event. And ultimately, the individual was placed in long-term care facility because they had no family that were looking out for, and it was the animal protection officer's attendance and alerting the human services that allowed both the animals and the humans to get the care that they needed. Again, unsanitary conditions. And one of the ones that we frequently get calls on is dental disease. Again, most of us have all had dental issues in our lives, and indeed, something like this with a mouth that bad, if the owner is not taking steps to provide care, something like this should be reported to the appropriate agency. I've got a quick case example. I've used a large animal example for this one. The complaint received was from a Sask Power employee who was doing work in the area, and they reported seeing thin cattle and what appeared to be numerous dead cattle. The employee, although providing us information, was reluctant to provide the actual number of dead. They just said numerous. And they did express that they had a limited knowledge and understanding of cattle. So that gave us reasonable and probable cause to attend. The APO attended on March 4th and found cattle were only eating straw. There were some windbreaks, but none of the windbreaks afforded reasonable protection from cold. It was clear that the water bowls that were there had frozen up and there was no water being provided. So we confirmed the complainant's observations. With the number of dead animals that were also easily observed, the animal protection officer returned to the office and completed a Form A out of the Animal Protection Act, which is an information to obtain. So it was detailing all of the observations to put it to a provincial court judge to issue a warrant, which was obtained. We also retained the services of a veterinarian who attended with the animal protection officers. The cattle were determined to be in distress and were taken into protective custody. And so here is what the animal protection officers observed when they attended the property. There was a large number of cattle that indeed were just eating straw, that were in a poor body condition. In fact, the veterinarian made mention of the fact that with the amount of straw that was there, was that He thought that the producer had really overdone it on the bedding until he found out that that was just the only thing that was being provided for feed. Numerous dead. Certainly you can see that even though there are windbreaks there, they're in poor repair and obviously wouldn't be providing suitable shelter for these animals. And you can see that these dead cattle had been there for some time. And in fact, the owner had started piling them up and there was actually predation with them. This had been something that had been going on for a long time, and the owner was well aware of it. And this is when we dropped a bale in to get the animals into an area where we could load them suitably into transportation and take them to a facility to provide care. You can see from the back end of this one cow, very obvious that they're hooks and pins, the tail head, the spinous process, and the lack of anything that this animal has been without sufficient feed for a significant period of time. So with the case example, we actually counted, much like any other crime scene, and put little flags up identifying the number of dead animals. We actually ran out of flags and had to create more. We had 225 deceased cattle. We seized 288 cattle, 14 of which were euthanized later due to their poor physical condition. So despite us providing them care, they were in such bad condition that they ultimately needed to be euthanized. And the owner pled guilty and received a $5,000 fine and a 10-year prohibition from owning all animals, not just cattle. Remembering these aren't just animal problems, there is a clear link between animal abuse and interpersonal violence, which often does co-occur. And there are human problems of some kind when there are animal problems, whether that's financial, death, divorce, depression, other mental health issues. And a lot of times we also see, as was the example with the neglect, there's older adult or child neglect. And animal abuse complaints are often a first step in getting the people help that they need. So that is me. That is my direct line. But to make a complaint, you can dial 1-844-382-0002 within the province of Saskatchewan, or just 306-382-0002. We also have on our website a report animal abuse form. It's pretty easy. You go to animalprotectionservices.ca and it's a click on button that says to report abuse. And that is my presentation. I'll stop sharing and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Don. We do have some questions. The first question is, if a complaint comes in outside of APSS hours to a Humane Society and they contact the proper authorities, City Police or RCMP, and the owner of the animal concerned does not allow access to the property to see the pet, would the police agency obtain the warrant or would they report it to Animal Protection Services?
It can be both. Depending on the severity and nature of the call, the RCMP or the police service of jurisdiction may obtain a warrant. In many instances, what happens is they will refer it to our agency, provide us the information of their initial contact and investigation, and they would turn it over to us, being the animal experts, to deal with the situation, and then we would obtain a warrant.
Thank you. The next question is, and maybe this is something that we can share, Don. We can send an email with it, but they're asking to provide a link to the body condition score. So I think you said you use the Tough scale.
So we use the Tufts Animal Care and Condition Scale for the animal's environment, and I can certainly provide you with a copy of that. We also use for companion animals the Purina Body Condition Score Scale with a 1 to 5, and I can also provide a link to that for you or provide that to you, Raj. or sorry, Josh. And then I can also provide the one for the livestock if they wish as well.
Sure, that would be handy. And we can share that with everybody. Once Don shares it with us, we'll pass it on via email. And then the question they also have, Don, is whether or not your slides will be shared with the attendees today.
Anybody that wants a copy of those slides, they're more than willing. I can certainly share that with them. If you want, I can share that with you as a PDF, Josh, and you
Sure.
can distribute that.
Absolutely, we can do that. Thank you. Our next question is, with regards to unsanitary conditions, if you have proof, photo evidence, actual kennels found covered in feces and multiple pens in the same condition, but the animals have already been removed from a property, can anything be done? At least a report made on the individuals involved in the case, in case anything happens again in the future?
So if you've got a situation where animals have already been removed, they're no longer in distress, but there's a concern that they're maybe being kept in conditions that is likely to lead to their distress. And we have these people, again, I can't guarantee that the individual will be charged, but having that individual investigated and that documented so that should they be involved in future law enforcement contacts and being aware of it, certainly something to report, yes.
Good to know. Our next question says, Don, could you speak to experience in regard to dangerous dogs and situations? Are you called in only on serious issues or bites? And also, would you
No.
say,
Oh,
sorry, there's a second part. Also, would you say the dog owners who allow their dogs to roam at large be considered neglectful?
good questions. So dangerous dogs are not something that falls under the Animal Protection Act, but we get this call all the time about it, and we will refer them back to our law enforcement partners with the information that the dangerous dog is identified in the Municipalities Act, and the individual can be charged under the Municipalities Act for even menacing someone. So charging at them aggressively, they don't have to actively bite. Charges can be laid in that situation. However, a provincial court judge is the only one that can determine or make the determination now that the dog is dangerous. As for the second question, so someone allowing their animal to run at large, that would fit again under either the municipality's bylaws or under the Municipalities Act. And I would only be providing my opinion that someone letting their animals run at large is being neglectful, but not something that they could be charged with under the Animal Protection Act. I always, when I'm trying to break it down to other law enforcement agencies about the importance of dealing with at-large animals or having their bylaw officers or somebody deal with at-large animals, is it's really frustrating for people because I go, would you let your 2-year-old wander next door and defecate in their flower bed? Then why is it okay for your dog to do it? It's just being a good neighbor and being a responsible pet owner.